In this room. Welcome to all of you. A very special welcome to Liz's family. I also want to give a very warm welcome to all of our panelists. You know they love Liz when they fly for 2 hours to give a 10-minute talk. You know, that's a sign of devotion. Thank you, panelists. This event is jointly sponsored by Stellenbosch University, and I've sort of, with my team, you've seen them move around here. We've done a lot of the planning in concert with Nelson Mandela University, and Professor Andre Keert, whom I'll introduce in a minute, has worked with me and our respective teams to bring this event to you. We both incidentally worked with Liz at the University of the Free State, and we can write a book just about those wonderful interactions with Liz, which included a lot of words that started with the letter F. Our purpose is to host an academic memorial. And thanks to Professor AI, I actually found a definition that suits the occasion. There was a memorial done by the employer, by Stellenbosch, on behalf of Liz. And there was also a wonderful memorial in Constantia done with Liz's family, which I was very privileged to attend. And so on. This is an academic memorial where we really try to remember a scholar, a thinker, a doer, in the context of their work. What the panelists will do is take the initial papers which you will hear together in a longer version, based in part on the feedback you will give in the discussion, in the form of what the Europeans call a vetschrift. And we will also be inviting other people who are not on the panel, but who also worked with Liz and know her well, people like Terry Lesure and many others. Mala Singh has also said she would contribute. Mala was actually, I think, Liz's first employer at the then CSD of the HSRC. And Mala will, among others, contribute to a book. We've spoken to a publisher which would put this together in the course, hopefully by the middle of 2026, so that there is also in book form a memory of Liz and her work, which we will hand over, obviously, to the family first. So that is why we are here. Professor Keert will now take over. He is the DVC Engagement and Transformation at Nelson Mandela University, where he also holds the research chair for critical studies in higher education transformation. He will now introduce the vice chancellors and also the chair of council of NMU. Andre, welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you so much for pitching for what would be, I think, a very, very special occasion to pay tribute to Liz's scholarly work, also to the family as well. So the first Vice-Chancellor is our host, Prof Lis Lange. Prof, thank you so much for availing yourself here. Daresh is the Rector and Vice-Chancellor of Stellenbosch University, a preeminent scientist in the field of chemical engineering, and specifically in chemical thermodynamics and separation technology, and also becoming the youngest full professor in the field in Africa at the age 31. Oh, that's impressive, right? So Daresh also served as the DST NRF South African Research Chair for Fluorine Process Engineering and Separation Technology until 2018. He studied at UKZN and obtained the degrees BSc Engineering 1993, and of course also his PhD in 1995, and of course another one was also achieved in 2000. So welcome to Daresh. Please give him a hand. And Liz worked closely with Daresh, so it's fitting that Daresh will make some opening remarks on this occasion. But two other, people within the governance field, which Liz was also a scholarly expert in, is our own Vice-Chancellor, Sibongile Mutwa, from Nelson Mandela University. She will deliver a message via recording, and she is, steeped in the public sector and higher education institution, a former DG of the Eastern Cape Province. Her work focuses on gender justice, social inclusion, and active democratic participation. She also chaired a very groundbreaking report, watershed report on the ministerial task team on sexual harassment and gender-based violence, now in South African universities. Also served 2 terms as the chair of USAF. And then, of course, our council chairperson, Judge Nambita Dambuza, also via recording, South African judge of the Supreme Court of Appeal and a former attorney within the Eastern Cape. She's also a visiting professor at the University of Fort Hare, and also a former chair of the Council of Walter Sisulu University. But we also have a council member here in person, Jonathan, says Eleanor Sisulu from the Nelson Mandela University. So also just to acknowledge those colleagues who made time to come and honor us in this particular respect. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much, Jonathan and Andre, for those introductions. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to our colleagues, good afternoon to friends and members of the Lange, Stewart, and Bennett families. It is my absolute honor to welcome you to Stellenbosch University as we gather to reflect on the life, the work, but importantly, the profound influence of Professor Lis Lange. So thank you for joining us both here in the library auditorium and online. As has been mentioned, this event is co-sponsored by Stellenbosch University and the Nelson Mandela University. But before we begin, allow me to acknowledge the distinguished guests and colleagues who honor us with their presence today, both in person and in online in some of the video messages that will be given. First of all, from Nelson Mandela University, Professor Sibongile Mutwa, the Vice-Chancellor of NMU, that's joining us through a recorded message. We also acknowledge Judge Nambita Dambuza, the Chair of Council at NMU, who's also going to be providing a recorded message. And a warm welcome as well, once again, to Professor Andre Kiert, Deputy Vice-Chancellor for Engagement and Transformation at NMU, who will play a central role today in the program that we have. And thank you as well, from a Stellenbosch point of view, to Professor Jonathan Jansen, Distinguished Professor of Education at our institution. And he, together with Professor Andre Kiert, did a lot of work in convening the symposium, and they'll be guiding today's reflections that we have. So a warm welcome to the many SU colleagues who have worked closely with Liz in the teaching and learning portfolio, particularly those from the Division for Learning and Teaching Enhancement, as well as the many student leaders I see in the audience. I think you've engaged with Liz and you all know that she was a very frank, direct person. We have a number of invited speakers and we are privileged to be able to be joined by Professor Nomalanga Makise from Nelson Mandela University, Associate Professor Kirti Menon from the University of Johannesburg, Lilumelo Tuyana, a photographer and visual artist, Professor Salim Badat from the University of the Free State, Dr. Rino Mara from the Nelson Mandela University, as well as Professor Danwood Chirwa from the University of Cape Town. So thank you for contributing your thought leadership and your scholarship to this symposium. As has been mentioned, we had a memorial for Liz as an institution a few weeks ago, and we were able to share on a much more personal level this attachment, but also this great person that Liz was. So to the Lange, Stewart, and Bennett families, once again, thank you for being here with us. Your presence gives today's gathering its deepest meaning, as it did when we had our institutional event. And finally, our appreciation to Tanya Arson for the organizing team and the corporate communications marketing of both Stellenbosch University and Nelson Mandela University for preparing today's events with great care. Now, this symposium is more than a memorial to Liz. What we have over here is an academic space, and I think you know Liz loved academic spaces. It's a reflective space. It's a space that Liz would have valued deeply. The goal today is not merely to celebrate her life, but to examine her ideas, to examine her leadership, and her contribution to the higher education sector in South Africa. I got over the last 3 years to spend a lot of time with Liz. A lot of the thinking that I have in terms of the direction higher education should take, a lot of the directions which Stellenbosch University should take, has been influenced by Liz. Liz believed that universities must think critically about themselves. She believed that inquiry, reflection, and importantly, constructive critique, which many of our institutions don't take well, are essential to institutional growth. When Liz joined Stellenbosch University, she stepped into a moment of real institutional introspection. She brought with her a wealth of sector-wide experience from the Council on Higher Education, the University of the Free State, and the University of Cape Town. But she also brought something far more powerful. She brought clarity of thought in terms of the direction that we need to take, but actually, more importantly, the direction we must take. She had a deep and unwavering belief that universities exist to serve society. So when you hear me talking at Stellenbosch University in service of society, you can see Liz's influence in terms of what we have over there. Not symbolically to serve society, but substantively. She saw teaching and learning as the core of the university's social contract. And she insisted that student success, curriculum reform, and academic excellence cannot be separated from inclusion and transformation. Her leadership of the Division for Learning and Teaching Enhancement strengthened this institution. It shaped the Siya Phumelele student success work that is now currently being done at our institution. It elevated the conversations about curriculum renewal. It helped in terms of the journey that we've been taking in professionalizing teaching and learning practices. And it grounded our understanding of belonging as an academic imperative, not an optional ideal. Liz was also a scholar who understood the tension between thought and leadership. She spoke about this tension in a Oosthuizen lecture at Rhodes University. She did not believe that academic leadership reduces scholarship. She believed it requires it. For Liz, leadership was an intellectual act. It demanded rigorous thought. It demanded careful interpretation of context. But most importantly, it demanded moral clarity. Her thinking sharpened ours. Her questions forced us into honest perspectives and honest reflections. Her precision guided conversations at moments when they could easily have drifted or fractured. Across the national landscape, Liz's influence remains unmistakable. Her work at the CHE shaped institutional audit processes and the national discourse on quality assurance. Her scholarship reframed how we think about the academic project, about student success, and about curriculum change. Her leadership across 3 major universities left a legacy that continues to shape the South African higher education sector today. The purpose of today's dialogue, as I said, is more than just a memorial. This symposium calls us to engage critically with the legacy that Liz has left, to reflect on the ideas she's advanced, to examine the debates that she's opened, to consider the tensions she's navigated, and to think together about the future she envisioned for higher education. The papers presented today and the reflections that follow will form part of a tribute and a legacy in her honor. A scholarly contribution that ensures her ideas continue to move through the sector that she helped to shape over her lifetime. In closing, to the Lange, Stewart, and Bennett families, thank you for sharing Liz with all of us. To our colleagues across the country, thank you for joining us in this work of reflection. To our speakers, thank you for bringing scholarship, insight, and care to this occasion. It's my privilege and honor once again to welcome you to the symposium. May today's conversations honor the intellectual courage and integrity that Lis Lange lived, but importantly, the ones that she also worked by. Thank you very much.
Honored guests, esteemed scholars, practitioners, I have great pleasure in conveying a brief message at this symposium in honor of our colleague, Professor Lis Lange. Like all of you, I was shocked and saddened at Liz's passing on the 8th of October. What a great life cut short. As Nelson Mandela University, who are humbled at the opportunity to participate in this symposium, both as higher education practitioners and as a community of scholars. I thank my colleague, the VC of Stellenbosch University, Professor Teresh Ramjugenath, for his generosity, as well as Professor Lis Lange's co-travelers, Professors Jonathan Johnson, Andrew Kiet, and others, for coming up with this idea of a commemorative symposium in honor of Lis. The chairperson of the Nelson Mandela University Council, Justice Nambita Dambuza, will say a few words about Liz's contribution as a member of our governing council. But before she joined our University Council, Liz was known to me and many of us working in the higher education sector as an influential figure in the sector with her transgressive and courageous insights on matters ranging from the politics and practice of the curriculum to asymmetries in policy and governance that are characteristic of the higher education sector in South Africa. The lineup of scholars that will talk at this symposium will undoubtedly reflect on some of her seminal works and her impact on the sector globally. Liz's contact with our university, however brief, substantially enriched the Nelson Mandela University community. Her grounded passion, her unvarnished sharp critique, which she dispensed without fear or favor, and her boundless love of students, her respect for responsible stewardship have left an indelible mark. Given the global and national challenges faced by our institution and higher education sector globally, Liz's critical thinking and analysis, her forthright critique, and her insights are going to be profoundly missed. In my role as Vice Chancellor, participating in Council, I was buoyed by her versatility on matters of executive management and governance of the academy. Her appreciation of how this could converge and at times diverge in our quest to center the student, serve the purpose of education better, and advance humanity through the canon of knowledge. At a professional level, I found Liz's contributions both exacting and refreshing, while authentic and balanced, always leaving room for self-critique and contemplation. She exemplified the best principles of accountability and rectitude in public office. Our condolences go to her children, her family and friends, her colleagues and collaborators here in South Africa and globally. Words indeed do fall short. I thank you.
Thanks. My name is Nambita Dambuza. I am the chairperson of the Nelson Mandela University Council. And it is with a heavy heart that I address you today to commemorate the life and immense contributions of Prof Lis Lange. Liz served our university council from July 2022 until her resignation in August 2025 because of ill health. While her time with us was brief, her impact was indelible. She used her considerable talents and commitment to social justice, her sound corporate governance, and higher education expertise for the benefit of our university. We honor not only the dedicated service that she gave to our university, but the profound intellectual legacy that she leaves for all of us in the South African higher education sector. In Council, and particularly through her work on the Higher Education Committee, Liz demonstrated her core belief that governance must serve social objectives. She consistently championed sound corporate governance that is informed by her deep academic expertise. Liz's tenure on Council and the Higher Education Committee was not on routine management and governance of the university. It was particularly meaningful because its focus was on deeper critical reflection and engagement. This platform was perfectly aligned with her commitment to sound scholarship. It offered us the rigor that we needed to navigate turbulence at our university. We deeply mourn her loss, but we celebrate the extraordinary depth and sharpness of her thought and the enduring strength of her convictions. To Jane, our hearts go out to you and to your family and friends. You know more than us how well and sincerely her life was lived. May her legacy continue to guide you and all of us as we strive to build a more effective, efficient, and just higher education sector. Thank you all.
Thank you to the Vice Chancellors and the Chair of Council for those really touching, moving messages. I'm now going to invite the first panel to come up to the front. That would be Prof Lange, Andre, Kirti, and Lihlumelo. Could you join us in front here? Thank you very much. Thank you. So the speakers will go in the order that their names appear in the program. I will introduce all of them at one go, and then they will just follow each other. Professor Nomalanga Mkhize is Director of the School of Governmental and Social Sciences at NMU, and I've not listened to her in person, but I've certainly followed her on different YouTube channels. A very, very exciting and thoughtful intellectual leader in higher education. Professor Andre Keert, of course, I have introduced to you previously. It's been an absolute privilege working with him and John Samuel, for example, in the Institute for Reconciliation and Social Justice, as it was then called, at the Free State University. And then Kirti Menon, also a friend of many years and a really astute thinker in policy and higher education. And the Future Professors Program has a phase 1 year at Stellenbosch. Kirti leads the second phase at the University of Johannesburg. Really wonderful to have her here. And then somebody with whom I actually wrote a book, a really wonderful student at Free State University those days, Lihlumelo Tuyana, who also you could find her less in the classroom. You'd have to tell me if I'm right, Hlumi, and more on the campuses with a camera and doing very creative work. So once again, Mhlanga, Andre, Kirti, and Lihlumelo, welcome. And I'll hand over to Professor Mkhize first.
Thanks. Thank you so much. 10 minutes?
10 minutes, and then if you go to 11, something will drop.
Yeah. I'll fall through the. Thank you so much. Okay, so the stopwatch must start. Thank you so much. I didn't expect to be put first on this program because I didn't know Liz personally. But here we are. So now I've had to think what it's like to have to speak first. As I was saying to Hlumelo, I can't say as others have said. So now I met Liz for the first time when she joined the Nelson Mandela University Council, where I was serving as a representative for academic staff. And while I'd heard of Liz, I did not know her personally, as I say. But when Liz joined her first council meeting, I immediately felt a sense of being emboldened. Because from what I knew about her, she was a left-wing intellectual with many years in progressive politics in South Africa and in the higher education context. So now as a council member, it was important for me that what Liz was bringing was a kind of intellectualized approach to governance that I feel is necessary at the heart of the university. It was also important for me that Liz's approach was formed from a tradition of politics and intellectual engagement that I believe to be part of South Africa's own long-standing tradition of discourse in the anti-apartheid era. In other words, for me, Liz's presence on council and my own presence on council, even though we did not know each other at the time, it represented a kind of tactical continuity, a kind of robust approach that South Africans have been historically accustomed to. Now, of course, the NMU Council does have intellectual heavyweights in it, but some of them are constrained by the limits of managerial responsibility. So some of the more robust engagements in council have to come from ordinary members like myself. So it was when Liz walked into the meeting, when I walked into the meeting and I was sitting behind, I was like, I know that head. That's Lis Lange. That means I won't look crazy now. And so that was a very important thing, to see a seasoned academic and experienced manager whose intellectual persona was rooted in robustness. And this was particularly important to me because I think one of the things that we're seeing is that governance in South Africa's universities and in general in public institutions has taken a bit of a bureaucratic turn. And so you need people like Liz who are very sort of willing to be positioned as much more intellectual interlocutors in the system. And also, of course, because we find that governance has been far more now about rules and auditing and all those things, rather than about being able to defend the university's ability to ask the big questions. So this matters to me because I feel sometimes sometimes in this new sort of bureaucratic environment, you can come across as being a bit brash or too much. So when Liz was there, it was like, she's my cover, And so, in other words, things like, this new regime of the King's reports and, ever famous King 5 of governance, those things don't produce true accountability in the university. And in fact, what you really need in the university is that intellectualized approach that asks the big questions, and then from those big questions, we are then able to deal with the technical and bureaucratic matters in council. So I think there is one example that I can use. I hope I don't get in trouble with the university, but one issue that we actually fell on the same side on many issues, big and small. So I'll just mention a small one. Somehow there was an emergent debate on foul language in the university, And I remember we were at George, and Liz and I was sitting behind Liz, and I was just like, wow, is this even an issue? Liz looks at me, and we're just like, why the fuck is this an issue? So it is really things like that that made sort of a kind of a resonance as a type of council member. Now, Liz wrote very critically about the university, and we both presented on the same panel last year at USAF, and I think we were engineered to be on the same panel. And that was very productive for me personally, because then Liz and I were exchanging ideas, and she sent me her writing, and we were engaging much more deeply together about our ideas. And for Liz, what was important was to make sense of the university in its contemporary conditions. Now, obviously, Liz is very well known for an anti-capitalist critique, but in her work, she was going beyond this now. She was really saying, how do you make sense of all this mess? The technological complexity, the planetary questions. She argued we have reached a limit as a civilization, individually, collectively, ecologically, right? And so she says, in rethinking what the university does as an institution, this has become urgent and unavoidable. She also argued that our epoch of capitalism as a social system is destroying and taking in its wake people and the planet. So there's an urgency to the question, so what is the university's response in that? For Liz, these deep and critical questions meant that we needed, as she argued, a more capacious critique of our times if the aim is to effect change in the university. And so she says her argument is really about trying to rethink whether we should be really actually abolishing the university as a privileged institution for education and knowledge. But these were amongst many questions that Liz was asking. So she was trying to move her thinking beyond the orthodox or the traditional Marxist critique. And she drew from a range of scholars, and she began to pose questions to us. For example, and maybe others will mention them, she would ask, how do we get out of this quagmire? She says, what would it take if for the top 1,000 ranked universities to step out of this ranking system? What would happen if we did that? What would happen if the research-focused publication patterns, appointments of academics, student selections was to step out of the market, right? She asked questions about curricular financial implications of rethinking the university in light of trying to develop alternatives to capitalism. She asked questions about technology and its impact on producing a malaise amongst the young, disconnecting the young from their ancestral knowledges and ancestral heritages, and in a way, both producing depressive personalities as well as narcissistic personalities. And I think that Liz put that narcissistic question in there because I think she'd seen how the contemporary university is producing both depressive malaise and narcissism, but in the context of broader social relations. And also Liz noted the contradiction of the African university within this broader milieu. And this is where we would have like engagement and slight of alternatives. Can we use the university, if we're not going to abolish it, for these different projects? And I think this is actually it. Being on the margins means we should be taking up that opportunity to try the different thing because it's no loss to us. And finally, what we have to produce then, in my thinking about being in the same rooms as Liz, is that we have to produce in the sector a scholar, manager, intellectual. We can't afford managers who are not intellectuals. We can't afford scholars who refuse to manage. And we can't have managers who disrespect both the scholars and the intellectuals. So I hope, Professor Jansen, that the professor's program is doing this thing. With that, thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Nomalanga. Of course, the rest to your clarity, I would also add the principles of integrity, rigor, and derogative reflexivity, because your Liz was so self-reflexive, and that's why she had the kind of authority to ask it of everybody else, even what one would call a critical ontology of the university. And like Sue McKenna says on Facebook, she didn't suffer fools, whether it's about people, thoughts, and ideas, and she can both be funny and ruthless when she goes off on one of these sharp critiques that everybody is speaking about. In one of our discussions, she once referred to education research as being in the grip of fair lady methodologies. Now, with reference to the old Lifestyle magazine, of course, I couldn't stop laughing, and I said to her, it's a good thing she didn't refer to the scope, as a form of methodology for education research. And then sometimes, tongue-in-cheek, she would suggest that I must just leave this work on transformation. It's not going to take us anywhere. I must invest in the idea of collective lobotomy as one of the interventions within the sector that will take us somewhere. And I worked with her on many scholarly editorships, and her commitment to a form of rigor within intellectual friendships extended across different kinds of roles, and she would ask the questions because she also loved people and she loved friendships. I know, for instance, her battle with me in terms of my smoking habit, because I know that she lost a friend not so long ago after she met me, who was a smoker as well, And of course, given that, I listened to her, I'm not smoking anymore. But that was one of the key things about the switch between intellectual friendships and, of course, also personal friendships. And so this idea of deep reflection is the way in which she manages her entire engagement with this scholarly project. In one of our current book projects, she submitted the chapter 2 or 3 months ago. In the postscript to the chapter, she says, when I accepted the invitation to write this piece, I did not realize the extent to which it was going to be an act of personal reflection, an analysis of my own experience in university management and of the doubt, uncertainty, and hope that goes into making decisions which sometimes are the wrong decisions. The higher education system, so she continues, in South Africa has been at the work of transformation for 3 decades, and I think there is an agreement that this work will continue. We keep on trying to theorize transformation as we go about it, and as circumstances and national and international conjectures change, we adjust our view about transformation and what we are doing and aiming for. And so in my reading of the engagement with Liz at the intellectual level, is that she has a couple of themes that comes together, and I know colleagues will talk about that. One is the quality assurance, equity policy, institutional and governance theme. The other one, of course, which is closer to my interest, was transformation and its knowledges. Now, Crane, in the report, which people say I shouldn't call this a Dean report, I know that there is a chapter on the question of knowledge in that particular report, which I suspect the sector didn't take seriously enough since after 2008, of course. And that was one of the key interests that Liz tried to drive through that work. Then, of course, the third one, she was, in the context of knowledges and transformation, also what the curriculum can do. What can the curriculum in a university do was also a big question. And then Nomalanga refers to this as well, the university as an institution became one of her big, big academic and thinking interests, and especially the university in techno-science society, and of course the university as a political pedagogy vis-a-vis Hannah Arendt, and of course the university and its critique of capitalism. I have never learned to ask and to probe deeper, but I have a sense that the brutal military regime of Liz's home country and the massive human rights violation, the Truth Commission, the disappeared memory, and all those perhaps generated for Liz a particular affinity for South Africa and a chance to actualize a global scholarly and political commitment to build institutions and their practices in this land. And that's why Hannah Arendt became such a productive co-traveler in Liz's thought, given her work on the Holocaust, and of course also to think beyond such kinds of massive human rights violations. And then, strangely enough, and I will get to this contradiction later on, the idea that Hannah Arendt could both theorize, both, theoretically, sociologically, and philosophically on the Holocaust, and then, of course, provide ways of trying to think a form of citizenship around the question of democratic education and the role of the academic, within the notion of political education. And that's why part of her work then later on shifted to the question of the university as political pedagogy. And then that work then shifted to the university as political pedagogy, to the university on the border. Because I think that it was meant to counter the self-annihilating pedagogy of the market, from which the solidaristic notion and citizenship may emerge. Because the question, which we would say in academic terms of relationality, is just a straightforward question of love and relationships within universities that are productive. And of course, with her style of interface, once you get to know her, you would know that, this is a particular thought processes that engage both with love and knowledge and critique in the same space as well. And she was particularly interested in Arendt's notions of understanding, because she thought that Hannah Arendt put forward a new idea of understanding, as the complex intellectual and moral processes that can generate progressive political action. So that's the connection with the university as political pedagogy, and of course the deep interest in students and the deep interest in political action as well. And of course she started some of those reading sessions as well at the Institute on a Friday afternoon as well, and Klumi can also say something more about that. But one can never know in this particular space, because to reflect on a scholar so close to oneself is a very daunting task. But I think that she used that particular framing that emerged through the engagement of the university as political pedagogy to reflect on student activism and, of course, the Masfall movement. And then she merges that later on, of course, with the critical treatment of decolonization, knowledge curriculum, and, of course, the broader idea of the university as well. But I do think that the university on the border became a framing frame in the later scholarly work of Lis. And as he so powerfully states, the university on the border as self-doubt as its constitutive principle, and that since this self-doubt was in fact the negation of self-assurance of the Western Knowledge Project, on the border was a good place from where to rethink the university. Just see how she describes both herself and the university almost in similar terms around the question of doubt, self-doubt, reflexivity, and so on. So there's a particular link that I also would like to explore later on. And so, with the idea of border emerging, so it's not only later on the university on the border, but also border thinking. That also then comes through in Liz's work, both as a position and as a strategy, and as a form of thinking and doing. And of course, she had in mind that this particular position of on the border and border thinking would be this incessant search for an alternative type of university to emerge, even against all odds. So we share a progressive politics, but we have beautiful disagreements and divergent thoughts on the project. I'm just going to share two, because you know everybody needs to fight from time to time in the intellectual space. So I have a strong belief in what knowledge transformation could offer the university, and I separated from curriculum change to escape my own thinking around the disciplining and domesticating effect of institutional power. I was more interested in this kind of wild, unregulated knowledges, that can touch the university and its center from time to time. And of course, in the university to play an experiment with some of this. But this would require a type of university leadership, which we don't have, with rare exceptions. These kinds of experimental type of governance and leadership we don't have in our universities. So Liz thought that I was too optimistic. She thought of me being caught up in the kind of idealism of critical theory. And I had to, of course, live with that critique all the time. And I think that it comes actually, on second thought, from a misreading of one another. Because I was not enthralled with this idea of an idealism, but I thought that knowledge as curriculum in the current context of this African academy is a much, much, much more difficult road to travel than the idea of undisciplined knowledges. For I have very, very little faith in Jonathan's book where this colleague shows that up. I have very little faith in the transformative capacity of the formalized university as is, but I have heaps of trust in untamed, regulated forms of practices that can take us somewhere different and better, But I know that this is not how universities think about themselves, because they think in those terms as destabilizing the university. Whilst that destabilization is actually the platform for educative self-reflection. And I know this because I lived through 3 universities that experimented during my time with this. University of Fort Hare, University of the Free State, and Mandela University. So these kinds of things are possible. These are not impossible things, to play on the margins. And so these struggles with our own contradictions and paradoxes, they are collective ones. They're not only Liz's ones or my ones, they are collective ones. One is that we are well aware of the structural constraint of the university and how the university steer our imaginations, both academic and political. But we also believe that just maybe our agency can speak that to structure. We share that idea of a feasible utopia, even sometimes if it disappears around the corner. And our second disagreement was on transformation modeling. Jonathan will know these debates very well. Liz thought about transformation as an institutionalization project. But because I was coming from the Human Rights Commission, and I knew that the institutionalization of human rights was precisely its death, I knew that there must be some form of deinstitutionalization that can be institutionalized, that retain the radical format that you would like to achieve. We haven't theorized that as much as yet, and I think that was the road that Liz was traveling on. in our later stages, is that how to figure out how can one have an institutionalized sense of transformation that is not domesticated or not so institutionalized that it disappears. And so she would argue about this idea of the kinds of fires on the margin type, which I also agree with, because I thought about like going in and out of the fire and visiting the center from time to time would be a nice space within the university. And I believe that good universities and good councils will have the courage to support these fires, even if they get burned by it themselves. That is to fund the work that will show up the challenges of the university that you are managing. Oh, there I am. There is the finger coming up. So I think, just one more minute, the question about Liz's intellectual courage. So crafting at the center, trying to open a gap in the darkness from which to frame and actualize a program, always doing so with a stellar command of critical social theory. So the rest, it is true that she was super excited with one such project here at Stellenbosch University in one of the faculties. So I could marvel at that spirit of possibilities, the analysis of a university that can't unshape itself, but a university within which we work to create these possibilities nevertheless. So you work even if the machine dictates otherwise, which is similar to Walter Benjamin's work. You encircle an impossibility until a gap arises, hope against hope, okay, which is not so far removed from the kind of other thinker that was frequently engaged with, which was Marx as well. So colleagues, there you are. That will be the kind of work that I want to do. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I worked with Lis Lange many years ago. My former CEO is, of course, present at the Council on Higher Education, where we were beginning a quality assurance system for higher education. I think she would have been quite proud of me today because Lis used to call herself a defrocked historian. For those of you who know, she, of course, was a historian by training and referred to herself very often as a defrocked historian. And part of what I'm presenting today, which is on behalf of myself and Gloria Castrillon, is a reflection on the evolution of quality assurance over the last 25 years, but looking at it through the lens of Lis and having worked in quality assurance. So I begin with the first premise, which is transformation institutionalized and yet emptied. I have to put my glasses on. In 2014, Lis issued a diagnosis. Since the early days of the democratic transition in South Africa, transformation as a concept has lost its intellectual, political, and moral content through becoming institutionalized. 2014. It was a philosophical intervention on her part, and we believe that what Baudrillard called the production of simulacra, copies without originals, representations that precede and determine the reality they claim to represent, transformation had become a signifier detached from its signified. Our paper considered how quality assurance became one of the primary mechanisms of institutionalization. The National Plan for Higher Education in 2001 called for quality assurance and imagined it as transformation's instrument, ensuring that equity and equality would prevail. The Council on Higher Education itself, as early as 2000, spoke about the quality and standards should be historically specific and related to the objectives of higher education institutions and to education and broader social purposes. 30 years later, we inhabit what we now describe as a compliance-bound system in which social justice imperatives have been subsumed or submerged. The machinery that has unfolded has proliferated with a new lexicon, accreditation, audits, reviews, standards, qualification frameworks, while the transformation it was intended to serve has stalled to a large extent. So we have produced what amounts to impressions of quality independent of actual educational transformation. The reality it once named has disappeared. The second was, Liz talked about my second premise, knowledge for and knowledge of transformation. And thanks, Andre, for leading me into that. Liz wrote, knowledge for transformation, which is the knowledge that needs to be produced to make change possible, and knowledge of transformation, which is the knowledge we generate about transformation itself. Transformation at higher education institutions needs to be in the interface between knowledge for and knowledge of transformation. This distinction is quite complex because when we were talking, we spoke over the years and our paths continued to intersect while she was at Free State, while she continued at the CHE, and while she was at UCT, and then later on Stellenbosch University. In fact, as early as June this year, we were still discussing an exercise that she was undertaking. But one of the issues that we talked about was that the current mechanisms of quality assurance, which we bemoaned very often, are unable to uncover the rich contextual realities of how institutions achieve particular indicators or fail to, and who determined these indicators, how they were determined, and whether any of our quality assurance systems could capture, and that what resulted is what Liz called knowledge for transformation, because standardized templates which were being used in quality assurance were unable to capture because they abstracted from the context and resulted in acontextual public shaming or celebration that hides deeply the real struggles and achievements of institutions. Premise 3 was the contradiction between ideas and instruments. At the USAF Higher Education Conference last year, she named a contradiction that goes to the heart of our critique. In the last 3 decades, universities developed policy and institutionalized change without really engaging the limits and obstacles to our own conceptualization and practices of transformation, or for that matter, the contradictions between our transformation ideas and the instruments we use to implement them. That was Liz 2024. We have found ourselves, of course, in the midst of these contradictions. Qualification standards, for example, have to satisfy multiple conflicting requirements ranging from professional bodies, criteria, registration, which become petty and prescriptive in operation. Audit processes evidence preconceived notions of what systems should be in place, what they should look like, making compliance difficult when expectations remain unarticulated. Professor Mala Singh, who was the first head of the Higher Education Quality Assurance Committee, identified this as the challenge of grafting neoliberal lineages and functions of quality assurance with a local emancipatory agenda which stressed social justice and social transformation. Liz pointed to the dangers of choosing neoliberal tools for transformative purposes and said, We thought we could use them productively, but we have to recognize that we haven't done particularly well in this regard. I'm sure she would have had choicer words for that. We have bureaucratized the system and, in a sense, institutionalized change in ways that is no longer transformative, but conserves the status quo. Thus, quality assurance, designed to advance transformation, has become a mechanism for conserving the status quo through compliance rituals that substitute for genuine change. The fourth premise was trapped in systems that we cannot critique. Liz talked about our collective paralysis, the idea that we can only exist in this context, that we are incapable of saying no because we are scared of the consequences that it may have for funding, for example, shows just how trapped we are in a system we are not capable of critiquing and do not know how to get out of. Thus, institutions begin to reshape practices to match expected appearances. They do not say no. Michael Power helps explain the mechanism. Audit routines coupled with deferential adherence to performance measures result in the maintenance of credible systems only in appearance. Liz's diagnosis goes deeper. She asked why we cannot critique, and more importantly, why is it that we remain trapped? The answer lies in her analysis of institutionalization itself. In 2017, for example, the Council on Higher Education undertook a 20-year review, and Liz noted that the review did not provide radical critiques of the shortcomings of existing policies or point out gaps in policy development or implementation. She was calling for precisely what the institutionalization of transformation had foreclosed: the capacity to think critically about our own practices, to name what is not working, and to imagine otherwise. Compliance thus substitutes for our responsibility. The auditable displaces the innovative. The fifth premise, from compliance to genuine accountability. Liz challenged us to recognize that we continue to invent ourselves in ways that are narrower and narrower. She urged us to reread the white paper, goals, and to recognize and own that we have drifted from the expansive vision of education serving democracy, equity, and human development. Accountability, as Liz understood it, requires agency. It requires what she demanded: engaging limits and obstacles, addressing contradictions, producing knowledge for and of transformation. Institutions must be able to exercise agency if institutional accountability is to mean anything. External quality assurance, we have agreed, had become ritualized and bureaucratic, failing to achieve the substantive goals that gave rise to their inception. Internal QA, on the other hand, there's still some hope, which is why we termed our paper Leading the Charge. I think Liz would have liked that because it has a sense of force in leading the charge, that institutions had to stand up and be counted. The courage to restore meaning. Liz spent her career insisting that transformation must retain its intellectual, political, and moral content. She distinguished knowledge for transformation from knowledge of transformation and demanded that we produce both. She named the contradiction between our transformation ideas and implementation instruments. She identified and, of course, called it out quite boldly, our entrapment in systems that we cannot critique, and called for radical analysis. And of course, she drew on Hannah Arendt, as we all know she would. And she asked us directly, are we incapable of saying no because we are scared of the consequences? In this development of a paper leading the charge, there's an attempt to say no, or at least to say that things must be different. We argue that the degree of quality control currently in play is beginning to have an inhibiting effect on institutions' ability to stay true to their own missions, visions, to exercise their own agency. We argue that transformation has become an empty signifier that conceals the absence of the reality it once named, and if so, do we have the courage to restore its meaning? In other words, and I think Liz would appreciate my last sentence, which is, the emperor's new clothes in quality assurance are a straitjacket. We hope not. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have decided to rather write because I've been out of the space in a very long time. So I'm going to talk about the list that I know. Professor Lis Lange's contribution to the South African higher education landscape stands as an enduring testament of intellectual clarity, ethical leadership, and unwavering commitment to the transformative power of the university. Her life's work spanning scholarship, institutional reform, academic development, and the cultivation of critical conscience reflects a rare combination of analytical rigor and profound humanity. To honor her is to recognize a scholar, a leader whose influence will resonate for generations. Today, I honor my dear friend, mentor, historian, and an intellectual lodestar, Lis Lange, a woman whose influence on my personal, academic, and professional life has been profound, transformative, and enduring. It is difficult to write about Lis. It is difficult because she was both complicated and simple, an apparent contribution to what makes perfect sense once you have known her. Let me try and explain what I mean. I shall start at the very beginning. I first met Lis in 2010 when I worked as a student assistant in the office of the rector and vice rector, Professor Janssen, at the University of the Free State. At the time, the institution was navigating a difficult process of racial integration and institutional reform. I was new to the work that goes into higher learning to navigate the complexities of a university trying to reimagine itself as a place where all races could find belonging. I was a third-year student from a quiet, rural, dusty town, Sterkspruit, in the rural Eastern Cape. Awkward at first meeting, with a questionable fashion sense then. I was trying to find a place for myself in two respects. One, as a student at a university, and secondly, as a staff member in the office of the vice rector, in the office of the rector and vice chancellor, where important decisions were being made about students who looked and sounded like me. But it was very natural that the office was defined by hierarchy historically, seniority, procedure, and formal distance. It was not a place for me. That was until I met Lis. Our first encounter was in a meeting where she was being courted to join the University of the Free State. It was in that room, in that moment, that Lis saw me, not as an errand runner or as a peripheral figure, but as a young scholar with ideas worth taking serious, a young thinker with a mind, a voice, and an inner world worth engaging. Her presence was striking, direct, confident, unafraid to speak truth without embellishment. To some, her forthrightness might have been seen as rust, but quickly I discovered that the profound compassion lived beneath her clarity. This duality, strength paired with warmth, made her leadership not only affirmative, but genuine, transformative. She asked about my aspirations, she listened, she affirmed, and in doing so, dismantled the power differentiations that so often shuffle genuine connections in the important and difficult work of running institutions of higher learning. One of the defining aspects of our relationship was Lis' insistence of engaging with me as an intellectual equal. She treated me with reflections of seriousness and often expressed appreciation for my insights. Through this, she modeled a rare form of leadership, one grounded not in hierarchy, but in reciprocity. Her recognition of my voice empowered me to claim the space in environments that had long felt closed and inaccessible. She made space for me. When I finished my undergraduate studies in political science and transformation, Lis appointed me to work with her in her unit, the Directorate for Institutional Research and Academic Planning. We called it DIRAP. There Lis's teachings continued as she shaped me as both a scholar and administrator. She taught me many valuable lessons, but what stands out most are her principles of leadership. Lis believed that leadership must be anchored in introspection and in an honesty reckoning with how we engage the world and those who inhabit in it. For her, leadership was not performance, but service, not visibility, but vision. It was the courage to see others clearly and respond with integrity. And she lived this. I know she lived this because while working alongside her, I became unwell and was not able to perform optimally. Rather than withdrawing support, Lis responded with honesty, compassion, and unwavering respect for my humanity. She asked difficult questions. She challenged me lovingly and ultimately supported my decision to begin an entire different career in photojournalism and documentary photography. Lis made space for me to be unwell in an institution of higher learning. And then she made space for me to find space away from her. Lis's reach extended beyond me. She made space for individuals. Dissent, I say, even discomfort and necessary conflict, and transformation in the institutions where she worked, especially at the University of the Free State. Lis stood as a fierce advocate for transformative potential of higher education and believed in an academy that nurtures the whole person, one that invites creativity, dissent, and exploration of diverse experiences. She championed an academic freedom as a living practice, a commitment to intellectual honesty, and the protection of vulnerable voices. I'm not alone in this experience of Lis. Many other students across generations felt this commitment. They recall her office as a space where struggle and scholarship met. Dr. Muafrika Lepolo remembers walking into her office as a student, an undergraduate student then, seeing a portrait of Karl Marx on the wall, and recognizing Lis as a rare friend in management as he shared with his comrades. He recalls how she offered lessons in class consciousness that shaped his intellectual and ethical trajectory, embracing a solidarity that transcends origin, Argentinian by birth, but African by contribution. Student activists from the FISMA's fall generation remember her as a steadfast advocate for justice during a period marked by national crisis. Bongani Mazula describes Lis as a pillar of justice, humanity, and courage. At a time where many student activists faced the threat of exclusion, Lis chose not to enforce power, but challenge its misuse. Rather than retreat into bureaucratic defensiveness, she confronted systematic forces that sought to silence student voices. Many activists credit her with safeguarding their futures at a time when exclusion and disciplinary actions seemed inevitable. She brought compassion and historical understanding to administrative spaces that often struggle to hold both. She never forgot that she too had once been a comrade and a student activist in a militant dictatorship Argentina. And because of her, as Mazula notes, many students stand today not as dropouts, but as graduates, living testaments of her belief in justice, dignity, and education as a right. Advocate Phumzile Sokhela speaks lovingly of a windy Sunday evening at a restaurant in Sandton Sea Point in Cape Town in 2022, many years after they had last seen each other, and following a difficult chapter in Lis's life at UCT. Lis remained steadfast in a call to service, serving institutions of higher learning, in truth, even when it was inconvenient and came at a high cost, came at a high own expense. Her truth mattered to her, she says. Dr. Talita Collins reflects on Lis with deep gratitude, noting her courage in working to creating university environments that are more resilient, inviting, equitable, and inclusive. She recalls Lis's fierce yet constructive feedback as invaluable, guidance that shaped and strengthened her both personally and professionally. Thank you, she writes, for your compassion, your fortitude, and your unwavering affection. For me, our relationship also lived in intimate spaces, movie nights, watching Spanish and French films and cartoons, conversations about history, talked about Fanon and Foucault, storytelling, reflections on the narratives that shaped our world. These moments deepened my appreciation for complexity, nuance, and multiplicity, lessons that continue to inform my life as a creative. All of this demonstrates that in every reclaim, professional, personal, philosophical, Lis embodied what it means to be an educator of consequence. She blurred the lines between authority and ally, scholar and mentor, leader and friend. Her lessons transcended academic content. They were lessons in courage, in humanity, and in the art of showing up authentically in a world that often discourages such openness. Her legacy lives not only in the systems she challenged, and the intellectual spaces she widened, but in the countless individuals she empowered, people like myself, Nanga Mso, Busiso Mhlanganisi, and Moses Masita. We carry her imprints into our own practices of thoughts, creativity. By inhabiting her full humanity, she created spaces for others to do the same, expanding the university capacity to include and critically self-reflect. She carved spaces for conversations about queerness that were nuanced, honest, and tender. Conversations that helped me to inhabit my own identity with great clarity and confidence. In institutions where silence on such matters was often the norm, Lis's courage opened new possibilities. Her influence reached beyond formal mentorship. She cultivated intellectual relationships and with deeply personal ground in generosity, curiosity, and shared pursuit of meaning. She invited others into conversations about storytelling, ethics, and the narrative that shaped our world. These engagements reflected in her lifelong belief that knowledge is not an abstract pursuit, but a rational and humanizing practice. As Toni Morrison writes in the tribute to James Baldwin, words that echo Lis's own impact, I quote, "You went into the forbidden territory and decolonized it, and gated it so that we could enter it, occupy it, restructure it, refusing to be defined by a language that has never been able to recognize us," close quote. In Lis's hands, we too saw how it meant to be neither bloodless, neither bloody, and yet alive. Through her scholarship, activism, mentorship, Lis Lange opened intellectual and institutional doors that many had long believed were sealed. She made space, critical, ethical, and deeply human spaces where others could imagine, flourish, and transform. Her absence is profound. Her legacy endures in the work she championed, the institutions she shaped, and the countless scholars, students, and colleagues whose lives she touched. Lis, thank you for being complicated and simple. Thank you for making spaces for us. You remain an extraordinary force in my life, an anchor, a guide, a friend, and now an ancestor. Your name lives in our collective memory, and your legacy keeps lighting the way forward. I hold your lessons close as always.
Thank you very much for 4 very inspiring inputs. I'm very conscious of time, and I know some of you have flights to take, so I'm going to release the panel, ask the next 4 speakers to come up, and then hand over to Andre to chair the session. So Salim, Marino, Danwood, and I'll join you.
Hello, colleagues. Okay, there we are. Salim, Reno, Danwood, and then, of course, Jonathan. Right, Jonathan has already been introduced. Salim is a research professor at the University of the Free State. Of course, we all know he was also in the CHE and, of course, Rhodes University. Is that enough, Salim, for now? And then Rino is currently the head and director of our medical school at Mandela University, but he also spent time with Liz at the University of Cape Town, where he was the chief operating officer. Thank you so much, Rino. Then we thank so much for coming as well. Dean of Law at the University of Cape Town since January 2019, also of course a member of the UCT Council. And of course, thank you so much for availing yourself here as well. So we'll go in the same order. We'll start off with Salim, Rino, Danwood, and then Jonathan. Salim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andre. And let me just quickly begin by saying that Mala Singh would have loved to be here, but it's impossible for her to be here today. And I'm that person who's got to fly at 5:30 from back to Durban. I came early this morning. So let me begin by saying that I think Liz's death diminishes something quite important in our lives. The loss of solidarity and friendship and conversations on serious political and theoretical questions and mundane daily struggles. And I think her loss is an immeasurable loss also for the university system for the reasons that we've heard. Her intellect, her innovative and incisive thinking, her thoughtfulness, her engaged approach, her scholarship, her accomplished administration, her social commitment, her incredible capacity for hard work, and the caring humanism that we've heard about enriched all our lives. And I think she personified all those things I'm talking about. Knowing Liz, she would scorn a tribute or even a festschrift that's a hagiography. And Jonathan has already observed that she was not everybody's cup of tea, to put it politely. The formidable intellect that she was, Liz, and I found it endearing, did not suffer, and I'm being polite, foolish thinking and conduct easily, and she said it as it was, and I enjoyed that. She was, as Jonathan has said, a tough, forthright woman with an extraordinary capacity for crap detection. I met Liz in 1998 at the Center for Science Development, and then she was at the National Research Foundation. Her intellect, her thinking, her straight talking, her many positive qualities attracted me greatly. And as the first and new CEO of the Council on Higher Education in 1999, I headhunted her as project manager for the CHE. In 1999, myself, Mala, Liz, and Kirti, and all of those who were there at this fledgling new institution that was meant to advise the Minister of Higher Education on policy and institute a new quality assurance system. Many of us came from activist backgrounds, including myself. And we understood ourselves to be involved in translating progressive values and principles into enabling systems and implementable strategies, programs, and projects for higher education transformation. And I mean transformation, not what passes today, for transformation. And she was excited to join the fledgling seat. It was very much part of her personality, the kind of work we're doing at the CHE. And very soon she became the first director of the Monitoring and Evaluation Directorate at the CHE. Her policy research and coordination work was seminal. Involvement in the 2002 new academic policy document, which was a tool. Producing the discussion document towards a new framework for the monitoring and evaluation of higher education. Publications on access and throughput, postgraduate studies, community engagement, the state of private higher education, the state of MBA provision, students with disabilities, governance in South African higher education, governance of mergers. All of that she was involved in some way or the other. This great versatility, and you had to be at the CHE to see her versatility, quite apart from her hard work, and her hands-on-deck approach, meant that alongside Mala Singh, she played a significant role in theorizing and building a national quality assurance system for university education. It's interesting because I don't think it would happen today. I sought out a philosopher to design our new national quality assurance system in Mala. Liz, as the historian, was a happy bonus on top of that. Today, I suspect we will be advertising for engineers, right? For technocrats, right? The designing and overseeing of this complex development of the program accreditation digital portal interface between universities and the CHE was almost entirely her work. Here was a new facet of Liz I never knew, getting involved in the technical side of things. It would have cost us millions, paying useless consultants from Deloitte and Touche and so on to come and design that system for us. Liz did all that herself. And you know what? With no expectation of performance bonuses. There was no performance bonuses in the CHE, like today. Our universities are full of performance bonuses. Her research-intensive work in preparing institutional profiles for all the higher education quality audits, her analysis of institutional self-evaluation reports, her preparation of HEQC audit reports gave her unparalleled insight into the core activities of universities, and it equipped her beautifully to assume management and leadership positions in time at universities. She was really one of the backroom dynamos of the CHE, not always in the public eye. That was Liz, because she was thoughtful, she was creative, she contributed in many areas of the CHE's work. Her institutional loyalty, her commitment and work outputs were constantly beyond the call of duty. And she was really, to acknowledge her, a critical and indispensable member of the team that led the CHE in the first 7 years when I was there and before I moved on to Rhodes. She displayed impressive thinking and practice related to learning and teaching, curriculum, academic program accreditation reviews, pedagogy and assessment, and she had intimate knowledge and experience of these issues, institutionally, nationally, internationally. Today, may I say this, teaching and learning seem to be considered just another management portfolio. You can put anyone there. As if leadership and transformation in these areas must not be theoretically informed, critical, imaginative, reflexive, grounded in empirical research and analysis. All the kind of things that Liz shone at. Critically, all too lacking in South Africa today with the corporatization and commodification of our universities. Her scholarship and practice was informed by important moral and social imperatives related to equity, social justice, democracy, and development. And she had nuanced notions of epistemic and epistemological transformation, quality, excellence, and standards. She was not one for conventional wisdoms. I've heard enough of these conventional wisdoms in our universities. And I got a mouthful of that at Rhodes when I started at Rhodes. She was not one of those. She problematized all these notions of quality and excellence and standards and things like that. And all these stood her in good stead to lead initiatives, programs in these areas at UCT, Stellenbosch, at Free State, and elsewhere. She was acutely aware, coming from a left-wing background, that questions of access, opportunity, and success were not just matters of efficiency, which is what they reduced to today, but that they're connected with issues of justice and democracy in South Africa, the kind of society we were wanting to build in South Africa. Liz's thinking, scholarship, and concerns engaged deeply with the issues of the purposes and roles of university and higher education as a public good. Today, it all seems to be about reputation. How are we doing on the rankings? What the purposes of universities are, what the roles of universities are not given much attention. She had sophisticated ideas to add to all her other strengths on questions of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation, the social determinants of those things, and how they articulated and intersected long before Kimberly Crenshaw entered the scene. She thought deeply and critically about questions of difference, epistemic, epistemological, social, and so on, diversity and inclusion. And she was acutely sensitive to social and cultural context, to place, if you like. And rather than adhering to trite conventional wisdoms, as you see a lot of today, she thought about equity, quality, development, and their relationship in complex and multi-dimensional ways. I see very little of that kind of thinking today, of how to hold together equity, quality, development, and so on. They're all being sacrificed for one or other at the moment. Liz, I believe, understood, and there's an email that I got not long before that around something to do with decolonization, that decolonization must be the transformation of the curriculum, as appropriate to the mission of a South African university, as opposed to a university in South Africa, which most of us are, which are largely imitations of Oxbridge and Humboldt. And she was well placed, I believe, to lead such an intellectual adventure and practical effort, which requires, in my view, theoretically minded and empirically grounded scholar administrators, what Kirti was saying. Scholar administrators who can lead, guide, and hold their own in difficult debates and exchanges with deans, scholars, and students. I think she would agree with Mala and I. This idea that everyone embraces the public good is misguided. Many administrators, scholars, and students want to avail themselves of the positional goods that universities provide them. So the idea of the public good becomes rhetoric because they are invested in the system. I was Liz's referee for a DVC post at UFS and UCT, and that was a pleasure because of the great respect and confidence I had in her. She was the Vice-Chancellor that should have been, but wasn't. Small and parochial minds saw to that. Given the opportunity, she would have made innovative and significant contributions, I have no doubt, as a Vice-Chancellor. And when I think about Liz, one of the things that makes me most sad was that in 2014, when I was leaving Rhodes University, at the request of Jakes Gerwel, to consider going to UWC, I was hoping that Liz would join me as one of the DVCs. And if I may say, it's something I think a lot about, because at that point, to my pleasant surprise, Crane Sudin, who's here, also contacted me to say, was there a place for him if I was going to UW? And I often think of what a dream it would have been for myself, Liz, and Crane to work together. And I'm now confident that we would have remodeled higher education and university leadership. Because in the company of those three people, I'm not sure we need one Vice-Chancellor. There could have been a joint collective leadership of 3 Vice-Chancellors with different portfolios and so on. That might have been too radical for the institution, but maybe that's the kind of radical thinking you need. The same kind of radical thinking I like to think we might have experimented with when none of us as Vice-Chancellors would have been the Chair of Senate. We would have the most senior professor as the Chair of Senate to keep the Vice-Chancellors accountable. The Senate belongs to academics. A great revolutionary has urged, live so that having lived, you can say with your last dying breath that you gave all for the liberation of humankind. Lis Lange, I believe, did that, making the university and research arenas her special domains of activism. And if we really want to honor Liz's example, then I think those who are at our universities today and those who are going to follow must be animated by her spirit and by her example. Thank you very much.
Truth is not what you want it to be. It is what it is, and you must bend to its power or live a lie. In presenting this tribute, I want to thank the UCT friends, colleagues, and comrades who so generously shared their thoughts and feelings. And typically, as so many said, and we all know this for ourselves, sometimes the best people and their impact is difficult to fully describe in the moment and in the moments to come. So good afternoon to colleagues, friends, and fellow travelers in the great adventure of higher education. I feel a sense of honor and sadness in celebrating the life of Liz, a scholar, a leader, and an unrelenting truth teller. Liz would, I suspect, have been slightly irritated at the formality of an event like this. She had little patience for ceremonial and even less patience for pretense. I think she probably would have said, oh, for fuck's sake, don't make it sentimental. Just say what needs to be said. And I hope, Liz, we can do so with some affection, a bit of humor, and lots of truth. Liz, the intellectual and the leader. Liz joined UCT in 2018 as a DVC for Learning and Teaching, at a moment when the institution, and indeed the higher education system, was still grappling with transformation, decolonization, and the question of social justice. UCT was and still is a complex and contested space. Liz entered it with her trademark clarity of mind and fearlessness of spirit. Her leadership was never administrative in the narrow sense. She approached the undergrad project not as an exercise in management, but as a deeply political, moral, and intellectual undertaking. Her work was grounded in theory, not bureaucracy. And she reminded us, sometimes very forcefully, that universities are not businesses, they are places of ideas, conscience, and public good. Liz approached even the most complex challenges with a fearless yet constructive spirit. Many of us can still hear her voice cutting through the fog of meeting speak with a crisp, "That's bullshit," a phrase that remarkably never meant mean-spirited, but was always clarifying. It was her way of returning us to the essence of the matter, to the ethical and intellectual spine of the university. Speaking truth to power. Liz is what Jonathan Jansen once called a ferocious integrity. She refused to bend to convenience or popularity. She believed that leadership meant naming what others preferred to leave unsaid, whether it was in Senate meetings, council deliberations, or national fora. Liz spoke truth to power, and not from a safe distance. She did it from within the system, while working tirelessly to make the system better. Liz's courage was most evident in her willingness to confront contradictions, to challenge the way we use tools to achieve transformative ends, or how we claim interdisciplinarity with rigid, outdated structures. Liz could see the irony, dissect it with humor, and insist that we do something about it. When Liz left UCT, many colleagues experienced a deep sense of personal and professional loss. Liz, the builder of systems and people. Liz was not only a critic, she was a builder. She shaped UCT's Vision 2030, embedding a moral and intellectual purpose into the university's future direction. She oversaw many reforms in quality assurance, student success analytics, and data-informed decision-making. Her fingerprints still remain on the student success projects, the South African Survey on student satisfaction, and certainly on the introduction of UCT's new learning management system, Amatuba. During the pandemic, Liz turned a university known for its procedural deliberations into an agile learning institution. She piloted governance models that were less hierarchical and more responsive. She was pragmatic, but never at the expense of principle. While private entities approached UCT for commercial partnerships that risked compromising the academic integrity, Liz, in the formal spaces, simply said no. I'm sure you know what she said in the informal spaces. During her tenure at UCT, Liz shifted the discourse around the academic project and championed with many humanizing language to articulate the core responsibilities as educators in our embedded context. She wanted colleagues at UCT to live in the classroom what it meant to be the highest ranked university on the continent. My sense is that the result of Liz's sphere of influence remains over the university in both overt and less obvious ways. Liz also mentored many of us, often early morning coffees or late night calls for those of you in the room. She had a way of making you feel both nervous and inspired, pushing you to think more rigorously, to write more clearly, and to care more deeply. She didn't flatter, she sharpened. She demanded that we match her intellectual honesty with our own. Liz's human dimension. With all her veracity, Liz was deeply human and embracingly so. She asked about our families, remembered small details, and offered help when no one was watching. Her colleagues recall her compassion as readily as her critical mind. She believed that kindness was not weakness. It was foundational of ethical leadership. During one of the hardest times in the Faculty of Health Sciences, Liz was a steady and compassionate presence, working quietly but effectively behind the scenes to support the faculty through uncertainty. Liz lifted many in stormy times when one really needed to be elevated. Liz led with wisdom, strength, courage, and a rare sense of vision and clarity. I so admired Liz's feedback to me with her depth, her precision, and her warmth. During intermissions of those very difficult meetings, either at tea time or at night, when she prefaced her feedback by using the name my birth name, Reno, I knew that we and I had done well. When Liz prefaced her feedback by calling me comrade, I knew that I was well loved. She simply said, "Comrade, you fucked up." There was also her humor, dry, unfiltered, and wickedly intelligent. In meetings that had gone on too long, she might mutter something that all had us struggling to keep a straight face. She laughed easily, but never superficially. Her legacy and reflection. English is such a beautiful language. To say that Liz's time at UCT was not without turbulence is a euphemism. It was stormy. She herself once said that it was the high point of her career, and yet it was also a place that tested her deeply. In the end, she left behind something far greater than policies or projects. She left a way of being, principled, demanding, and compassionate in equal measure. Her influence extends beyond UCT. Everywhere she went, Liz challenged us to align institutional practice with moral purpose, to think analytically, yet act humanly and humanely. Liz reminded us that courage must be met with compassion, intellectual integrity is not negotiable, and that universities must be judged not by their rankings, but how they treat their people. I knew this was going to happen. So this afternoon, as we remember Liz, let us honor her by doing what she would have wanted most: to think more deeply, to act more courageously, to lead more ethically. Let us remember to laugh, because Liz would have rolled her eyes at too much solemnity. Liz lived her truth. Liz leant into it and bent to its power. Liz did not live a lie. Thank you.
Let me start by thanking Professor Jansen for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I still have 1.5 months to go as Dean of Law, and hope you're not putting me in trouble for asking me to speak about Liz.
and her contribution to UCT, because it is well known that there were issues there. She didn't live well, and we cannot ignore that. And in my reflections in the paper, which I've already written, I won't go into details of this, but being a lawyer, we love shenanigans, we love controversy, we love fights. And so in my paper, I'll be careful in presenting some of these issues, but in the presentation here, I won't go into those details. What has struck me the most here is that we've listened to reflections from 5 institutions where Liz was affiliated with and worked. And they're quite consistent in the person that they're describing, whether as an academic, as a leader, and as a colleague, as it were. And these reflections and descriptions also are very consistent with what we heard from the family at the memorial that was hosted in Constantia. I was fortunate enough to work under Lis Lange, who was our line manager. She was the line manager for all deans at UCT for, at least in my case, 4.5 years. And in my paper, I reflect on 3 or 4 areas in which Liz made the most, perhaps, notable contributions to my faculty, the University of Cape Town, and the broader higher education landscape. In most ways, colleagues have already touched upon this. And so I will only, by way of emphasis, go through these very quickly. But there's one area which has not been touched upon, which I will perhaps speak a little bit more about. The first is that you remember that in November 2017, the Council for Higher Education had issued a letter to the Faculty of Law giving notice of the withdrawal of the accreditation of the LLB program at UCT. This was serious news. It shocked the institution. It embarrassed us, especially as a faculty. Liz at the time was in the process of being employed at UCT. Probably she had already been given an offer. And as the institution was recovering from shock and taking rearguard action, there were recriminations in the faculty that followed this. A crisis of unimaginable proportions. No one predicted that an institution like UCT could ever lose its accreditation for its LLB program. Liz was tasked immediately with the responsibility of helping resolve that crisis, well before she had started working at UCT. She and Pakeng were dispatched to the faculty to address the issue right away, and Pakeng, who was senior to Lange at the time, literally let Lange take charge of the discussion in the faculty. After that meeting, the faculty knew what we had to do, and she set up a committee which she headed, she chaired, to deal with the submission of the improvement plan, the development and submission of the improvement plan, which was needed to rescue the accreditation of the LLB. And indeed, that was done 6 months later. In the paper, I touch upon the management and leadership style of UCT because I experienced that differently from you because I worked under her and you were a peer of her. I want to repeat what has been said here. And in the paper, I try to highlight at least 5 characteristics in the context of UCT that would make a successful line manager for deans. And I think, and I argue here, that Lis Lange exemplified all the characteristics and qualities that I'm describing. She was highly dependable. She was someone who could listen to argument. You came with your ideas or in need of help, and she always provided the answers or fresh ideas. If there was something that was coming from the faculty, she listened first to you and gave you an opportunity to explain what had happened before she made a decision. And when she made a decision, she would explain to you why I have reverse the faculty's decision and why I've replaced the decision with something else. Above all, she always took decisions, whether difficult or not, within the shortest time possible. One thing I appreciated the most was this was the person you could rely on. If there was something that was moving, you could ask and she would fight for you. The greatest achievement at UCT, perhaps, the way I would describe it, is how she recalibrated the balance between teaching and learning and research. UCT was known and championed itself, pitched itself as a research-intensive university, and it defined its approach to teaching as being research-led. Everything was geared towards this mission of the university, and that meant many things. But what it meant is that teaching was not so much treated as a priority model. It was subservient to research. Liz, within a short space of time, tried to change that. And by the time she left, that balance was, you could say, equal. I might reflect more on how that happened. There were some moments that helped this, but she played a big role in doing this. But this was not a person who was promoting populist teaching ideologies of the time, at least in the context of UCT. So I give some examples here of the decisions that she took, which show that she was not a simplistic teaching advocate, as one could say. One of the examples I give is that the faculty had experienced and introduced an extended program, LLB program, 5 years instead of 4 years. Our preference is for the postgraduate LLB, which is you do another degree before you study law. Those are the most successful students. But the politics of the situation demands that we have this 4-year LLB program, which are students straight from matric. It doesn't work, and the market doesn't like that. Then we're required to introduce an extended program of the 4-year program. It was hopeless, it never worked. But to call it, to stop it, it was so unpopular. But when the data, we showed that this program never worked, despite the pedagogies of support that were being promoted at the time. We tried everything, but it never just worked. Liz listened to these arguments that we had, and she said, okay, we're going to shut this program. And it was shut down. As we speak, we get better students from all races who are postgraduate students who perform much better with greater throughput in the LLB program. Two other areas I touch upon, the last area I touch upon is, has something to do with what you have said, which is the introduction of performance metrics in the university, which are borrowed from the corporate world and have such a deleterious effect. And I use this because Liz, as part of this, even her, failed to fight this on her own. So she accepted this and wanted the deans to produce what are called KPAs, KPIs, and that nonsense, to use the language that Liz would use. And so when she asked us deans to produce those things, we were so shocked, and she met stiff opposition. And it took many weeks of conversations to understand what it was. But she was persuaded. So she said, okay, I'll try with my colleagues and see what will happen. She didn't succeed. So my colleagues said, you talk to the Vice Chancellor and the Chair of Council because you have a good working relationship with them. I asked for meetings, I got a call and received a tongue lash properly. Then they said, okay, we'll try somebody else. You're not diplomatic. So they chose the Dean of Humanities to do the same thing. When I checked, I compared notes with her, I said, I will not speak about it. Let's just forget it. Why? So this led me to think about what is going on here. So I studied how the university in South Africa is described. And there's a fundamental problem with the structure, the anatomy of the university in South Africa. And that's what I talked about in the paper, which is that it is defined as a higher learning institution constituted by three bodies, Council, Senate, and the Institutional Forum, with Council holding all the powers, and academics ignore this fact. They labor under two myths. The first is that they have academic freedom, which is non-existent in practice. The second myth is that Senate has sovereignty, enjoys sovereignty in academic matters, which is not the case. Senate's powers are so poorly defined, it is a subordinate body to Council. Even its academic functions, which are not properly specified, in carrying out those functions, Senate has to account to Council. Anytime you have an interventionist Council, which has extraordinary powers, people don't realize this. Once you have an interventionist Council, which will be acting legally within the current conception of the university in South Africa, Senate has no power. It has no powers of accountability. What this means is that what we think are the managers of the university, in truth, as Dean, I found out, these folks are not really the bosses. There are other bosses behind them, and they run when those bosses call. And these are the people we're supposed to account to. We're not even, I was not meant to account to my line manager. There was another group of people I was accounting to. In return, I was supposed to reverse my accountability function to the head of department. And the head of department will have nothing to do with this. So, in short, this is the major problem I deal with here, and it had to deal with how Liz was able to respond to views that were not her own, and to take them on, accept them, and champion them for others. That was the greatest quality I thought that she had. And she suffered for this at UCT.
Okay, I won't be very long because I'll fight with you later. I won't be long. It's been a long day, but I do want to just share, and like you heard from Danwood, you will have access to the longer papers in a few months' time. So I want to dig a bit deeper into the academic interiority of Liz. In other words, what was going on inside of Liz's thinking when it came to a real tension in her life, and that is the tension between being an administrator on the one hand and being an intellectual on the other hand. And I looked for literature on this for 3 weeks. I called people around the world who work in these areas, and they said there's no literature on this particular species. To be sure, South Africa has had in higher education very good administrators who were also good scholars. I think of Ilan Gevers, A-rated scientist, published with a Nobel laureate in cellular chemistry, but that's not an intellectual. That is a really good number 2 administrator who is also a good scholar in his discipline. Robin Crew at the University of Victoria, who B-rated entomologist. He would sit in management meetings and then rush off to go and attend to his bees. He studied bees, and so on. But that is not what I mean by intellectual. That is a good scholar in biochemistry, who also is a very good administrator, Bilan being a very good example. Then there are vice-chancellors who have been very good intellectuals, present company included, but they weren't administrators. In other words, you'd be hard-pressed to find Salim on a Friday afternoon working through the HR data. You know, for that he has people who do the heavy lifting, and his role is oversight of those important functions, from infrastructure to IT and so on. But he doesn't do the heavy lifting, etc. Mampela Rampela at UCT, intellectual, not necessarily an administrator. Pani Pachana at UNISA, etc. Great intellectuals, but they weren't administrators. What Liz does, as a particular kind of leader is to both do the heavy lifting, whether it's in DIRAP, on institutional research, or whether it is on teaching and learning policy at UCT. She does the heavy lifting and is able to think like an intellectual. Now, how does an intellectual think? Different from the normal scholar. The intellectual is able to make connections between the minutiae of university operations and the bigger questions in society. So let me show you that on the next slide. But before I get there, these are the two questions related that I try to answer in this particular piece of thought. Can you in fact live in those two worlds? Because some people, particularly academics, will say these are incompatible vocations. In other words, the administrator is a machine. You know, the administrator just counts, etc., etc. And the intellectual, of course, doesn't do that. So, you know, when you have lived, like Salim and I, on both sides, Daresh on both sides of the fence, you eventually get irritated with people who say, oh, the neoliberal university, go away. Well, think about that for a minute. What if we just let it go away? Liz understood as a realist that there is corruption in higher education, that there are people who give away degrees that are not worthy of the name, that if you left everything to the neoliberal university argument, many of our universities would collapse. And so she understood as a duty the need to be, watch the words, effective and efficient, but in a way that asks deep questions about being effective and efficient, and so on. So that second question is very important to me. Can people like Liz think deeply about these things and change it outside the context of immediate application? In other words, she's working at Stellenbosch University, but she's not just trying to understand Stellenbosch University, she's trying to understand a system and also a world system that enables these problems to begin with. Next slide, please. So I looked at 5 cases and I studied them very closely. And by the way, for those of you who are interested, when you see the book, my colleague, assistant, Leanne at the back there, she went to look up every single publication of Liz in the English language. I'm sure there's some in the Argentinian language and some in the F language, but we just went and looked for those. And so you will have this in the book at the back, every single thing she's written and thought about as far as we could get a hold of it. And so I looked and I said, how did Liz, the administrator, deal with these issues as intellectual problems at the same time? And these were the 5 that I looked at. So obviously I don't have time to go through all of them, so let me just jump to the next slide and give you examples of how this worked. So when Liz had to pivot, now I cannot think of anything more difficult to do if you're a number 2 at a university than pivot in the middle of an epidemic from face-to-face teaching to emergency road teaching. I mean, that is, just trust me, a massive job, okay? There's anxious parents who are saying, will my kids still get their degree? There's anxious students saying, will I graduate in time? And there's a whole lot of academics saying, I don't know how to do this, particularly if you're adult's age, you know, how do I suddenly go with all these technologies and try to make sense of things? So Liz is able to do that, but in a series of papers, she actually writes about how in the world system, the pandemic didn't happen by accident. It was enabled by corporate greed. It was enabled by our irresponsibility in the face of public health. And she beautifully shows the connection between the little things and the big things that enable things to happen, and so on and so forth. The rise of the evaluative state. So on the one hand, she's got to measure things, right? She's got to monitor things, whether it's at the CHE, the HSRC, UCT, Stellenbosch. She's got to count. But she counts in a way that she also asks questions about what's worth counting, as you heard earlier. And so she goes to the work of one of my favorite thinkers in this area, a European called Guy Neave, who shows you that what was happening in South Africa with this clamoring to measure everything was not a South African problem. It had to do with the rise of what he calls the evaluative state. And Liz is able to make those connections between the small things and the big things well beyond the borders of South Africa. Next slide, please. If you really want the insight into Liz, go online and download the Donkey Oosthuizen lecture. It is the first. I worked with Liz for a number of years. We spent many, many hours together because I was so dependent on her as the number 2 at Free State. In that lecture, she talks about how I struggle to take my intellectual self out of my managerial shell. Now, Liz is a private person. As you heard, she doesn't like talking about herself, or let alone being celebrated in this way. But this is a fascinating journey. Then she says, you know, I really struggle with these democratic impulses in me, the anti-managerialist, the anti-authoritative, and yet I've got to make, I'm paraphrasing, I've got to make the university work. And then this precious phrase, this struggle is an intellectual, moral, and political battle inside myself. This, I believe, is what the great theologian Augustine meant by getting a peek into the interiority of the self. Next one, please. And then everybody's scared to talk about UCT. I don't know why. Maybe you're scared you'll be sued, maybe. But I saw Liz, a very confident person. I saw her lose her confidence at UCT. Fire me if you wish, Daresh, but it's the truth. It's the absolute truth. I've never seen somebody who was so confident, so incredibly intelligent, so caring as you had, lose her confidence because of what happened at UCT. And this is not one person. UCT has to answer the question, why did you hire her twice? Okay? And then you had this incredible impact on her health. And she says, this is Liz, the courageous free speaker. It seems silly, she says at the UCT seminar in historical studies, that I'm in this place. And I can't really tell you what I think. Do you know what that means for Liz? It's a denial of the very person she is, very, very deeply. And this is on YouTube where she says this, and I thought to myself, my God, you know, for her this must have been absolute terror. Next slide, please. And so Salim already referred to this, but I just want to, you know, in the South African university, there is no reward for thinking. There's only a reward for producing. I remember when my son was showing off, he was 6 years old, 7 years old, and I drove the neighborhood kids to school in Pretoria. So all his kids, all these friends are in the car, and he wanted to show off. He says, Dad, what does a professor do? Now, up to that point, I have to be honest, I didn't think about what we actually do. You know? So I said, son, they pay you to think. There's not a lot of thinking going on in our universities. With Liz, there was, of course, there's no reward for thinking. And I remember the day, as if I can actually see it right now, the day Liz walked into my office in Bloemfontein with her CV. And she looked away, she didn't look at me. And she looked away and she threw the CV on my table. We had a very respectful relationship. And she threw the CV on the table. And she said, how must I improve that? How must I improve this? What was Liz asking? How can I get recognized, as all of us want as academics, in a place that doesn't reward thinking? She didn't say that, that was my interpretation. So I knew I was up against it because I was responsible for lifting the academic standards for admission to the professoriate at Free State University, and it cost me a couple of lawsuits from people, because they said that they first feared the black guy is going to bring down the standards, and then they feared he's raising the standards. What the hell do you want, you know? And how do I go to the same group when I had worked with conventional criteria to lift the standards? So I gave a feedback after reading the CV 100 times. And then, because the question in my mind was, how do you account for the fact that Liz turned around institutional research into a powerful instrument, holding us accountable as a university, and for maximizing participation in this. Terry worked there, Nicolamello worked there. It was a fantastic team of people. How do you reward that? How do I reward the fact that she wrote the strategic plan of the university? How I did reward the fact that when she stood up in a council meeting, having written yet another suite of policies, that Justice van der Merwe looked at her in front of everybody before he could stop himself. He says, I've never seen work of this quality. How do you reward that? Than a bloody thing in the Mediterranean Journal of something at CUT, you know? No, it's serious, you know? How do you do that with a person like Liz? So I went to the promotions committee and I made an impassioned 15-minute argument for recognizing she became an associate professor. But there were grumblings, as there normally are, etc. Next slide, please. Liz, I want you to know, made sacrifices. She could have been selfish and say, you know what, as a historian or policy studies per scholar, what I'm going to do is invest in myself. But Liz doesn't do that. Liz throws herself at Free State, at UCT, everywhere, even at the CHE, where Mala Singh talks about that crushing work ethic, you know. She throws herself into all of that, and as one of the people I interviewed for this paper said, one of the senior people at UCT, people recognized her as the de facto vice-chancellor. So when you say that the vice-chancellor says to her, you take over that, there will be a reaccreditation process, it's because she was trusted to be able to do that at high level. She wrote Vision 2020. I don't know what this vision is, Daya, I'll have to go and read it. But in other words, all the deans reported to her. Crucial functions, HR, finance, all reported to her. Okay? That comes at an enormous cost. Almost done. Next slide, please. I really spent days thinking, must I put this in here? Then I eventually said, typical Liz, oh, well, fuck the academy. Let me just say this, you know. Imagine you come into a meeting every single day and somebody higher up says to you, Associate Professor Lis Lange, in a mocking way, this is cruel, this is childish, but she told me this one day, and I tell you, you're sitting here at this, what's his name, this meat place, and I just cried. I thought, how can you be so cruel for somebody who has sacrificed so much of herself for higher education? You mock her? I want to set the record straight today. That last slide. Second last slide. Mala Singh, in a normal, incredible intellect, says, this is how Liz reconciled all of this stuff in her leadership. Whatever she took on was normatively framed, theoretically reflected on, strategically apposite, and operationally efficient. So in her own mind, she is able to make those connections between the administrator and the intellectual. Last slide, please. She struggled nonetheless, as you would have heard today, in doing that. Next slide. Oh, that is the last. I just want to set the record straight and say thank you, Professor Maria Lis Lange. So Andre and I will just do some closing remarks, and then we'll be on.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, colleagues. Thank you so much. We would have wanted, of course, some reflections on Jonathan. Don't you think we should take one or two comments? If there are people who would like to share a comment or two? Right. Please, Eleanor.
Thank you so much. Unlike many of you, I didn't have the privilege of knowing Liz for very long. When I joined the Nelson Mandela University Council, and I was really fascinated by Liz's insights. And there's a conversation that I would have liked to have with Liz, based on her presentation at the USEF conference, on the issue of technology, digital platforms, and the universities being captured. And that this issue of AI that has been, I feel that we're still talking about neoliberalism, and yet we're facing a tsunami in the form of AI, which is going to change the whole landscape of higher education. And those, I think that for me, I'll miss Liz so much for that. Another thing that interests me about Liz is that the fact that she's Latin American. It was clear from her accent when I didn't know anything about her before then, but that she's here in South Africa. And we are dealing, and I like this phrase, Argentine by birth and African by, was it African by practice? But we're facing a global rise of xenophobia, anti-immigration, and xenophobia in South Africa particularly, and Afrophobia. And this is a conversation that I wanted to have with Liz about her own experience and what do we do, and the fact that universities are, contrary to any principle of academic sense, required to report on them and only have so many foreigners. And so this is a conversation which I miss Liz for, that I would have loved to have had. And I think that idea of someone who comes from somewhere else and arrives in a place and sees and understands more than people of that place is something which really fascinated me about Liz. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Eleanor. We'll take one more comment, colleagues, and then I'll ask Jonathan to come and close and give us a sense of where we're going, after this. Okay. Eleanor, yes, correct. The question of technology and AI and anti-immigration, we will have to find a space to talk about that as well. Jonathan, please come around and then just pull things together.
Eleanor said exactly what I wanted to say in closing, and I'm going to amplify what she said because this is very, very important. We are under attack at the moment in South Africa. I never thought it would happen this fast. I knew it would come, and that is a creeping xenophobia on our campuses. It's coming from government. I always used to think that universities might be spared that kind of backward thinking, but it's upon us. You see it in the new policy on internationalization. You see it in a whole lot of parliamentary portfolio committee meetings on YouTube. I have to say, I don't recognize my country. I don't recognize this kind of madness where the university is the only place in which, of all these major institutions, in which you can say what you think, in which you can appoint whom you like, in which any student can study regardless of the accident of geography. The university is that place. It's not a church, it's not a mosque, it's not a synagogue, it's not a football club. It is a place in which we must defend that the best ideas, the best people have access to our institutions of higher learning. And I think what Eleanor is saying, imagine how much poorer our universities would have been if there wasn't this mad Argentinian, as somebody lovingly called her, to give integrity to our program. Imagine how poorer we would have been. And in those moving words of Lihlumelo, just imagine how many students, you see, we all know Liz is the tough, what's his name? But you talk to the people who work here at UCT, and so on, the secretaries, the people, they would talk of a person who was kind, of a person who was generous, of a person who was never arrogant, in a service. So I'm just saying this to you because this thing is going to come and hit all of us. I can't be more specific, unfortunately. And I hope all of you who are South Africans would make it clear that you are not, UCT to this day struggles with the shame of not appointing Professor Archie Mafeje because the state put pressure on the council not to appoint an eminent anthropologist, I think it was. Think of Mahmoud Mamdani. Look at the horrible Islamophobia and the horrible sort of attacks on him for being born in Uganda, his son, who is now going to be the mayor of New York City. I think, ladies and gentlemen, we are better than that. We are better than Trump's America. In this country, you cannot. Foreign student enrollment at American universities has dipped by 27% this year for the fall semester. 27%. And the truth is, none of our universities would attain the status that they have, our top universities, without having a professor who is a dean of law, okay, without having Professor Sibasiso Moyo, who leads us on the research function. I can give many, many different examples, and Mahmoud went through that stuff, as you know, as well at UCT. So I'm just giving you a heads up. I hope you will all stand in. This is a word we don't use a lot in higher education. It's called solidarity. You stand together based on your values. So finally, as I said, you will all see the book by June. I will press very hard. Andre is very slow in turnaround because, you know, he's in management. But we will produce, and thank you to all the panelists, and thank you all for coming. There is some refreshment. For those of you traveling back to the southern suburbs, can I just give you advice for somebody who lives in the south? You don't want to drive right now. Okay. All right, so have something to eat, please. Thank you.